the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Did they ask you to read Plato in the first or second year of college, or maybe even in high school? I remember my Philosophy 101 class at Denison reading Plato. I don't remember a whole lot of it, I have to say, as good as my teacher was. But I do remember the allegory of the cave. Do you remember Plato's cave? He said, okay, imagine you're all prisoners and you're being kept in a cave, and you've been kept in this cave since as long as you can remember. Not only are you being kept prisoner in a cave, but you are forced to look at only one wall. So you're sitting with the other prisoners facing one wall. Behind you in the cave, your captors have made a fire. And in the light of the fire, with them moving around and occasionally moving an object, you can see shadows flickering on the wall in front of you. But that's all you see. And because you see it, that's your reality. The shadows are real as anything would ever be, but only because you haven't seen anything else. Let's say you get lucky and your captors say, you, unleash you from your chains and turn you around so you can actually see the fire. And you see the objects that are casting the shadow and you think, oh, the fire is real. The sticks that they're handling are real. They're real. But you're the only one who's seen it so far. Let's say you get even luckier. And they say, you know, we're going to let you outside. You come out of the cave, and what happens? From having been in the dark for so very long, the sun hurts your eyes, you're blinded by it temporarily, and then you see things that you have never seen before. Trees, grass, people, faces, things that would have been impossible to see in the cave. You're confused. Is this real? Or is what I saw in the cave real? If you go back to the cave and tell the other prisoners what you've just seen, they will think that you're not sane, right? You've lost your mind talking this wild talk about something called the sun. That's the allegory of the cave. And Plato wrote it probably 300 or more years before Jesus was teaching, 300 to 400 years before this incident from the Gospel of John, where he heals a man born blind. But I think of this image of the cave when I read the story of the man born blind, because, well, I think there's some similarities here. In the Gospel of John, John tells us the same stories often that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have told. But with John, there's always more going on. There's always more than meets the eye in the Gospel of John. And in this story, I think that this is not just a story about a man who is healed. I think it's a story about us. The man born blind is us. And it's the human condition that, like the prisoners in the cave, we don't see very much. And we're apt to mistake what we do see for the only reality. Until someone, in the gospel story, it's Jesus, someone comes along and lets us out into the sunlight so that our eyes are opened and we see more. We see more. The people in the story in John say, well, who sinned? Whose fault is it that this man was born blind? Jesus says it's nobody's fault. It just makes a better story about God, and not a story in the sense of something that's untrue, but this is a story about God and what God does. And if you and I are born blind, then God in Jesus is helping us to see. How is it we are born blind? I don't see a single person here today who would have that diagnosis. There's not a white cane among you. So you're not blind. However, can you, without the aid of a mirror, see the back of your head? No. Can you see a molecule or an atom without a microscope? No. Can you see Neptune without a telescope? No. Our physical sight is limited. We see some things very, very well, but our physical sight is limited. Okay, let's take this up a notch. Our emotional sight is limited. Have you ever walked into the office in the morning having just had the worst trip to the office ever and have no one notice? Right? Not a soul. You could have tears streaming down your face. Did they know? No, we're blind sometimes. We're blind sometimes to ourselves, our strengths, our weaknesses, the way we really look, the way we really are in the eyes of other people, and we're often blind to one another, whether because of our own preoccupation or our lack of experience or our lack of ability to focus and pay attention to one another. Sometimes we're just plain blind. We can drive through the Bronx and not see it, right? Do you know where the Bronx River is? You've driven along it many times. We don't always see ourselves, one another. We certainly don't see the world we inhabit. Not consistently, not with 20/20 vision, not with our eyes open. But let's take it up yet another notch, because this is what I think Jesus is really talking about. It's not just our physical sight or our emotional ability to see what's going on in the world and with one another. It's our spiritual sight. The Bible narrative says that since the fall from the Garden of Eden, we've been unable to see God without disastrous harm because we can't contain the sight of the infinite. It blows our minds literally. And great movies have been made about it. You remember Raiders of the Last Ark, that terrifying scene at the end where they open up the Ark of the Covenant to see what they really are not prepared to see. The reality of the infinite, the limitless space, the eternal. We can't see it unless our eyes are opened. And honestly, sometimes we don't want to see it. Hence the conflict when the man born blind begins to see. This is a conflict story. He starts to see, and the religious authorities, named the Pharisees here, but you could almost read this for any religious officials. They're disturbed. Who did this? How did this happen? Well, a man made mud and put it on my eyes, and now I see. Well, he did it on the Sabbath. So they start to parse it, and we've edited this so that it wouldn't take us 20 minutes to read it out loud. But, you know, what we're taking out is like, well, the Pharisees say, well, then, this isn't the man who was born blind then. This is somebody else. They discredit the man who's been healed. Then they go to his parents and attempt to discredit them. They're like, he's grown, you ask him. Then they discredit the healer. He did this on the Sabbath, therefore he's a sinner, therefore he couldn't have done it. This healing is too much for them because it's coming from outside of this set of rules about how life ought to be lived. This is bigger than the rule system. So if you go back and read this story, take your leaflet home today. As the man begins to see more and more, he sees that Jesus is a man. Then he sees that Jesus is a prophet. Then he sees that Jesus is the Son of God and sent from heaven. He's seeing more and more, and the religious authorities are seeing less and less. They become more argumentative. They become more obtuse, until Jesus, at the very end of the chapter, will say to them, look, now that you've seen and you still don't believe, now that's trouble. That's trouble. If you have seen and you still don't believe, that's trouble. Our blindness has to do with the unseen world. But I'm afraid it also has to do with the world we can see, which, honest to God, is just too much for us. What is it T.S. Eliot said? Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. When our eyes have been opened, it takes more courage to live remembering all that we've seen and know about the world. If we're going to live remembering all that we've seen and heard and all that we know, we're going to need help. That's why it's so wonderful that Jesus is in the story. You don't just see this by ourselves. You know this. Maybe you spent a semester abroad. Maybe you traveled to the Middle East. Maybe you work in the Bronx. Maybe a friend of yours has been devastatingly ill, or a cousin of yours is addicted. You know more than you want to remember some days about the nature of the world. And sometimes even religion tempts us to close our eyes again and say, well, I don't want to know that. You know? Please let me go back to my narrow focus. I was just fine with my little world and my little set of rules. It was working for me. But this just blows it wide open and says, no, there's so much more. There's so much more. There's so much more. It's like the little fish in the ocean, the new baby fish that goes to its mom and says, Mom, what's all this water I keep hearing about? It's all around. His mom says, you're in it. That's why you can't see it. You're in it. God's limitless creation, moving beyond the bounds of time and space, is all around us all of the time. If our eyes are open, we begin to see it. And if we are faithful in our walk with God, we see it more and more. How often we are tempted to think that religion is going to bring us into a narrower point of view, when the whole point is it's going to bring us into a broader point of view and enable us to look safely upon the things of the world, and finally, to look safely upon the face of God. Wow! How cool is that? How cool is that? I heard Bishop Gene Robinson speak a few weeks ago. He was the first openly gay bishop elected in the Episcopal Church. He's now retired, Bishop of New Hampshire, and he came to speak to a group. He said, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear. What makes us want to close down again and close our eyes again is fear. But perfect love casts out fear, and as we increasingly become the vessels of that love, the fear begins to melt away. Because above all, in some ultimate, wonderful sense, we are safe. Safe. Doesn't mean that bad things won't happen. Doesn't mean that we have the cure for cancer, that no ill will befall us, that trouble will never come, but that in the deepest possible way, we are safe. I found this week a poem by Rainer Marie Rilke, translated by Joanna Macy and Anita Barrows. This is just a part of it. But he's writing in the voice of God. Listen. I am, you anxious one. Don't you sense me, ready to break into being at your touch? Can't you see me standing before you, cloaked in stillness? I am the dream you are dreaming. When you want to awaken, I am that wanting. I grow strong in the beauty you behold, and with the silence of stars, I unfold your cities made by time. I am, you anxious one. says God. May our eyes be opened to what is really real, and may we be confident as Christ guides us to see more and more until we see him in his heavenly kingdom.